Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on James by Percival Everett. This was the National Book Award winner last year. It's the latest book from Percival Everett, who is, in my opinion, one of the great contemporary writers. A novelist who's really probing in interesting and compelling ways. And so I was really interested to read this book. It is a book that I think everyone knows follows a classic story and takes a character within that story and gives us a different perspective. And that can be a very rewarding experience. Madeline Miller was very successful with this in Circe, I thought. Sometimes it can be less successful. But Everett is always a voice who is, as I said, probing. He's asking questions. He's interrogating the histories, the traditions that we receive, whether they're social or historical or literary. And he does that in James. He does it to some very interesting effects. So there are aspects of the book that I really loved, that I really got into, and I appreciated. There are the signature Everett moments of the very, very ironic humor that runs through his stories and his novels. His ability to take something that is received and then perceive it in an interesting way is one of his greatest strengths as a writer. It's something that he draws on the great traditions of satire and of irony to expose the truths that sort of underlie our received traditions. But there are also aspects of the book that I thought keep it from being, honestly, his best work. I think he has 2-3 books that are probably better than James, but it is still well worth a read. So I wanted to get into it, explore some of the examples of where it really does excel. And then just talk about a couple of things that I felt could have been developed more. So James is following the story of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, but it's from the perspective of Jim, who will become James, and that development is something that Everett's going to explore across the book. It is a book where we are primarily spending all of our time with Jim. So there are aspects of Huckleberry Finn that pop up, for example, drifting down the river. Huck and Jim together drifting down the river, the experiences of going into the house where there turns out to be a body. And we see Jim's perspective of these different events in a way that shifts the humor from Twain's original book. And so there were moments in Twain's book where there's deep humor, there's moments of deep horror as well. Everett is taking those moments and then he's shifting them because they're now from the perspective of Jim. That the horror of slavery is much more real. It is very clear, and it's written in detail on these pages. We see what Jim's own personal experiences are when he's whipped or beaten. We see the terror he has of what will happen to him if he's caught as a runaway slave. We see his efforts to try and make decisions while he's absolutely afraid for his life. And that lends itself to a real development into his character, into his mind, and that's well done. And so I wanted to share a few passages, but there's also this fascinating aspect of Jim's interiority where we get into who he is, the fact that he can read. And that's a secret. It has to be a secret. It's been a secret for a few decades, ever since the aftermath of Nat Turner's efforts to rebel against slavery, that slaves are not allowed to be taught to read. If it's discovered that they are readers, they will be, murdered or punished in some horrifying way. That's something that Jim is well aware of, and he's trying to work through. And so there's the contrast of his slave voice, the voice he has for everyone, where it has the sort of the dialect of that time. But then there's his interior voice, or the voice he shares with his fellow Afro-Americans, where he's very articulate, he's very erudite. So there's this passage where we get that sense of who he is in his mind. My face felt fat and numb, and my hands and feet were without feeling. But where I was bitten was extremely painful. I felt weaker than I'd ever felt. If I had had any real food in me, I might have vomited. My head was spinning, the world was spinning, and I didn't know if it was from the venom or from anxiety. I lay still, at first feeling the concerned stare of Huck, and then a spiraling into delirium like down a whirlpool. I burned with fever, and the chills I was feeling were almost interesting. I saw Sadie and Lizzie. They stood on a little wooden dock, took vegetables from a little boat, and piled them in big straw baskets. Then I was in Judge Thatcher's library, a place where I had spent many afternoons while he was out at work or hunting ducks. I could see books in front of me. I had read them secretly. But this time, in this fever dream, I was able to read without fear of being discovered. I had wondered every time I sneaked in there what white people would do to a slave who had learned how to read. What would they do to a slave who had taught the other slaves to read? What would they do to a slave who knew what a hypotenuse was, what irony meant, how retribution was spelled? I was burning up with fever, fading in and out of consciousness, focusing and refocusing on Huck's face. François-Marie Arouet de Voltaire put a fat stick into the fire. His delicate fingers held the wood for what seemed like too long a time. I'm afraid there's no more wood, I said, which is fine because I am hot enough, too hot. He reached in again and moved some charred pieces around. He looked at his blackened fingertips. I'm like you, he said. How is that? He wiped his hands on his pants, left smudges. You shouldn't be a slave, Voltaire said, sighing. He sat beside me, moved to feel my forehead with the back of his hand, and then thought better. Like Montesquieu, I think we are all equal, regardless of color, language, or habit. You do you? I asked. However, you must realize that climate and geography can be significant factors in determining human development. It's not that your features make you unequal, it's that they are signs of biological differences, things that have helped you survive in those hot, desolate places. It's those factors that stop you from achieving the more perfect human form, found in Europe. Is that right? The African can be easily trained in the ways of the European. Of course, he can come to be more than he naturally is, to learn those manners and skills that will allow him to become equal. Yeah? Yes? That's what equality is, Jim. It's the capacity for becoming equal. The same way a black man in Martinique can learn French and so become French. He can also acquire the skills of equality and so become equal. But I repeat myself. I hate you, I said through my fever and chills. You realize, of course, that I've been bitten by a snake, only to have you come to me in this delirium. Well, yes, but all men are equal. That's my point. But even you have to admit the presence of, shall we call him the devil, in your African humans. Voltaire adjusted his position and held his hands to the fire. You're saying we're equal, but also inferior, I said. I'm detecting a disapproving tone, he said. Listen, my friend, I'm on your side. I'm against the institution of slavery. Slavery of any kind. You know that I'm an abolitionist of the first order. Thank you. You're welcome. And this discussion continues. Jim's ability to dream in dialogue with famous writers and thinkers is something that marks the narrative out. It's an interesting way in which Everett allows a character living under slavery to argue with and push against the arguments that are being used to dehumanize him. And Jim's ability to do this and articulate this is something that is not only wildly different from Huckleberry Finn, but allows Everett to really have someone under these experiences, suffering their immediate horrors, push against them and fight against them in very real and compelling ways. And I think it is one of the features of the book is Jim's tendency to have to code shift, where he will have to remind himself, oh, I can't use this voice, I can't use these words, I can't speak proper English to anyone who's white, because then they'll figure out my secret and my life could be in immediate danger. And so his having to constantly navigate this world is something that, it's not it's not a mysterious metaphor, that Everett's noting that people still have to do this. Individuals still have to do this, and have to think, okay, which phrases am I allowed to use in this situation? Which ones allow me to be perceived in the light I want to be perceived? Perhaps it is as educated or as intelligent, or it could rather be in some other way, to not feel ostracized. And so that's something that Everett does, I think, accomplish really well across the book. In another passage, he has Huck playing a joke on Jim and allowing us to see that some of the aspects of Huckleberry Finn that folks have for over 100 and something years lauded as great humor and comedy are actually dehumanizing at the expense of Jim. And so after a while, with the river black, deep, and lit only by the moon, I quite miraculously spied Huck kneeling on the raft. I could tell from the constant swiveling of his head that he was in a panic looking for me. I pointed the canoe toward him and lay back, leaned against the thwart, and pretended to be asleep. I listened as he tied the two vessels back together, then pretended to wake. Huck, you is alive, I said excitedly. Of course I'm alive. What else would I be? Well, drownded for in one. How that can happen? I could see the prankster mind at work in the boy. How that can happen when you right here with me, he persisted. But Huck, we've been separated for a spell. What are you talking about, Jim? You've been asleep this whole time. I've been watching you. Now, so we've been separated, you and me. This big old riverboat come by, and when I looked down, you been gone with the raft. 'Twarn't no riverboat. Sure there was. No, Jim, you've been sleeping this whole time. No, I said. I fell asleep, sure, but that was after. You dreamed all that, the boy said. Having me on was giving the boy much pleasure. Sure enough seemed real. Them people on that boat, they wasn't real? No, Jim. Lottie, Lord, I said. Sure was a scary dream. Huck started laughing. He pointed at me and laughed harder. You mean you was pulling on my leg, I said. He was enjoying himself, and that was all right with me. It always made life easier when white folks could laugh at a poor slave now and again. I had you going, Huck said. I acted like he'd hurt my feelings. White people love feeling guilty. I'm sorry, Jim. I just thought it was funny, he said. Yeah, it'd be funny, Huck. Sure enough funny. I pushed out my lower lip a bit, an expression I displayed only for white people. I didn't mean to hurt you none. It could have been my turn to experience a bit of guilt, having toyed with the boy's feelings, and he was being too young to actually understand the problem with his behavior. But I chose not to. When you were a slave, you claimed choice where you can. We drifted, steering clear of both boats. Jim, you belong to Miss Watson, right? I mean, you her property. That's right, I said. So truth is, I'm stealing you from her. Well, Huck, now, you didn't exactly take me from her, did you? We sort of come this way together. But I didn't give you back to her, did I? No, you didn't. And this allows us to have Huck starting to have some realization of the truth of right or wrong, not just the right or wrong of the law. But it also is giving us Jim's perspective on Huck's pranks. And what does it feel like to be the butt of Huck's pranks and to know that you have to play along with the game because, once again, Jim is constantly under threat. And so it's a passage, and there are many like this, where Everett interrogates the reader and says, okay, 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago, when you read Huckleberry Finn, what were your experiences? How did you perceive the book? And now how are you perceiving this story now? How are you perceiving this person now in the character of Jim? And frankly, in the character of Huck. The differences are interesting. For example, the Duke and the Dauphine are much more venal and pathetic and just clearly charlatans and people who just seem dirty. That they just seem like even more comically pathetic and awful than Twain did, but they're not particularly funny. They're clearly dangerous. They're liars who are constantly seeking a way to take advantage of Huck, to take advantage of Jim. And Jim is able to perceive this in a way that the way Twain was writing the book, Huck was, but the imminent danger was not as obvious to him. And so, like I said, the book reads very well. I don't think one has to have read Huckleberry Finn to appreciate what Everett does here, the way that he continues to question institutions, question the historical racism here in the United States, but also elsewhere by bringing in Voltaire. He is now able to interrogate the imperial French colonies and to push against those. And so those exist, but I do think the book reads stronger if one is familiar with Huckleberry Finn. I wanted to share one last passage where Jim is really, towards the end, thinking through some of these. I had heard of an underground railroad. I wanted it to be real, even if I could have no truck with it. Some people were finding a way north. That was what so many of us, needed to believe. It pained me to think that without a white person with me, without a white-looking face, I could not travel safely through the light of the world, but was relegated to the dense woods. Without someone white to claim me as property, there was no justification for my presence, perhaps for my existence. And that passage really gets to the core of what Jim's experiences are across the book. He is constantly striving to find his way to safety, his way to a world that is more just and more fair, and being pulled in different directions of how do I survive, but also how do I move in some direction towards what I need and where I need to be going. And not just safety, but also a reunion with my family and safety for all of us. What are the decisions he has to make when he encounters other people who are under the bondage of slavery? And he has a choice to make about, do I try to help this person? How much risk can I take on and still feel like I'm going to be safe? while helping this person, or do I have to leave this person here knowing what happens, knowing, that this person will likely live only a few more years or a few more weeks and die. And that happens several times. Jim is confronted over and over with people he wants to help, and who have in some way a respect for him, who see him as the human he views himself as, the human that he is. And part of the pathos is Jim constantly having to make a decision of, does he preserve his life and survive, or does he risk his own life, honestly, on behalf of one of the handful of people who are perceiving him as an actual human? That is really where Everett is at his strongest, I think, in the book. It's something that I think on a cursory reading, because the book can read so quickly and fluidly, on a cursory reading, it's easy for a reader to miss that. But that's the deepest horror for Jim himself, is not the threat of and the actual like graphic description of how he would be murdered, like horribly murdered, in this book. It is that he's constantly having to weigh a choice and make his decision. It's the infamous philosophy trolley problem, repeated for Jim, and it's with people who are vulnerable in different ways and who respect his humanity in different ways. And I think that was the strongest aspect of the book that has stayed with me in the time after I've read it. As I said, I think it's very good, but I don't think it's Everett's best. If this was your first experience reading Percival Everett, there are other books of his that are really, really phenomenal. I think the first one I read was The Trees, which was one that I was shocked when I read, that I had never heard of this guy that was writing something like this, that he had been writing for, I think, 20 years at that point. And now 5 years later, he's being recognized even more widely. But The Trees was really, really fantastic. I know Erasure, which I read last year, is phenomenal. This was really, really powerful, very strong, incredibly well written. There is a facility that Everett has with language where he can play with it. There is a real ability in Erasure where he formally experiments. Again, that there's a real comparison of a black character who feels like he has to adopt a different voice in order to be viewed as a writer and to be a successful writer. And the great joke that he pulls in Erasure is fantastic. And so there are some other works of his that I think. I Am Not Sidney Poitier was pretty good. I think that was good. That's probably on a par with James. But The Trees and Erasure both really get at something in a fascinating way, and I think in a way that develops just a little bit more. If there's anything, I would have liked James to be maybe 40 pages longer and just flesh out the ending. We build to an apocalypse, and then it happens so quickly that I think that's why I was struck by the emotional content of James's decisions throughout the novel, of if he can only rescue one of two people, who is he going to rescue? Or if, can he go back for someone and save someone? And that happening multiple times, and him having to live with that decision throughout the book, made the ending feel like it explodes, and then it just, the fire just burns out right away, almost, in terms of that moment at the end. And I think another 20 pages here or there could have helped develop that and really put this as just his most outstanding work, up there with The Trees and Erasure. That was my personal perspective. Everett certainly draws on the historical slave narratives. I think William Wells Brown, most certainly, but there's also elements. He never really explicitly quotes Nat Turner. I don't know that Jim would have been expected to be aware of Nat Turner in the preceding decades. But there are elements of Frederick Douglass' narrative and sort of how he had learned to read, and Jim's ability to read and how he's taught others. That comes in as well. The essays of James Baldwin, I think, and their reckoning with racism in the U.S. And with economic oppression on top of the racism, and the way that people who have not often encountered Black people will perceive them. For James Baldwin, his experience out in Switzerland, with children in Switzerland who had never seen someone of African ancestry, recent African ancestry, like their perceptions of him, I think those come through in Everett's writing. The mention of the Underground Railroad calls up one of the other great sort of 21st century books, and brings to mind Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad, a fantastic novel. The horrifying murders that occur across the book recall James Weldon Johnson's autobiography of an ex-colored man, and specifically the concept of characters who are, and historical truths of people who were able to be perceived as white, and so they passed as white rather than having to live as a black person under constant threat. And that was something that James Weldon Johnson was examining. There are elements that popped up very clearly in James. Octavia Butler's kindred with a modern 20th century woman time traveling back to the horrors of slavery and constantly feeling that experience and being her being under threat with her modern mind is something that I think Everett probably drew on. The Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and this feels more of a distant influence, I would say. I think that this is more of an influence in Everett in terms of the consciousness of a character being underground, rather than the character's whole existence being underground. Certainly Toni Morrison's Beloved, but also her later work on Mercy, which I think is very much a distillation of a lot of the ideas in Beloved, are two books that come to mind. And then, of course, Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, the writings of Voltaire, frankly, Rousseau with his Confessions. There's a way in which it constantly seems as if James is a book being written by Jim himself, and that it is, in a sense, his form of Enlightenment era confession. But as I said, I think the book is very good. And as always, I'm curious to see what Percival Everett's going to do next. If you've never read Everett, don't start with Dr. No. It's a great James Bond pastiche, but that's honestly all it is. It's not particularly good. But The Trees, Erasure, Some Kind of Blue, I'm Not Sidney Poitier, James, all of these are fantastic books. Take a look at one of those. Again, I hope everyone's doing well. Thanks.